Welcome, everybody, back to You Have Permission, the show that aims to take both Christianity and the modern world of science and culture very seriously. My name's Dan Koch. I'm a licensed therapist and a post-evangelical. I don't self-identify as ex-evangelical. We're going to get into that. And I'm a liberal Protestant, and what I'm trying to do is stay blessed and let go of the rest. Sarah, I don't know about you. That's what I'm here to do. That's the voice of Sarah McCammon, NPR journalist and author of The Ex-evangelicals. Sarah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I have been following you like on Twitter and just sort of aware of your journalism for many years now. So this is a real treat for me. You've written this book, The Ex-evangelicals, and sort of from my perspective, it's like the first semi-official, I don't know, like coming from a writer from a reputable news outlet, like kind of sort of like a general culture look with some journalistic care, but then of course it's half memoir, at this movement that I have been swimming in for the last 10, 15 years. And it does feel kind of crazy that there is like finally this book coming out. And thank you for taking the time and making that happen.
Thank you. Yeah, it's one of those things where like if you're a journalist and you see a story, you want to write it, a good story, especially if it's one that you're interested in or is relevant to your beat. And this was one that obviously I have deep ties to, and probably I saw it because of my own connection to it. I kind of accidentally wound up covering evangelicals. Like it wasn't something I set out to do. In fact, for a lot of my career, I wanted to steer clear of anything like that because it was too close to home. But I wound up covering the 2016 campaign and specifically the Republican primary. That's what I was assigned to cover. And it was like an unavoidable and huge central part of the story. And something I was really interested in because of my own personal background. And so I started paying a lot of attention to some of the fractures in the evangelical movement. I didn't identify as evangelical at that point, hadn't for a while, but obviously knew a lot about it, that world, and had been super shaped by it. And sometimes felt like the media didn't get evangelicals right. And sometimes felt like, in a lot of ways, sometimes didn't gave them too much credit, sometimes didn't cover them fairly. Like, I just felt like, I know what this is. So I felt like I had sort of one of my colleagues said it was like a superpower knowing about evangelicals. But then I started paying attention to some of these fractures and kind of noticed that there was just this huge growing kind of movement, if you can call it that, a lot of it online where people like us were talking about what it's like to grow up in this subculture. And I always say it's not just about Trump, but I do think the Trump moment and all the conversations around evangelicalism the last several years have catalyzed some of these other conversations or given them, new life.
I was just thinking about the chronology yesterday, actually, and I started my first 2 podcasts in 2016, and one was a direct result of the Trump situation. It was called Depolarize, and it was like my attempt to do whatever I could in my little corner to stop Trump or whatever, which I knew it was like too late to influence the election in any meaningful way. It would have been too small anyway. But it also worked well as kind of a way of helping people like myself anyway make sense of what was going on in that culture. And it was from a fairly evangelical perspective. And I ended up covering so many religion topics that I realized I needed to stop that and do this show instead. And so within a few years, I had made that change. But my other show was called Reconstruct, and I did it with my buddy John. And that predated Trump, and we had been working on it for a while. And so there was already certainly this kind of maybe like post-emergent church, pre-Trump kind of deconstruction movement. You think about the Liturgists podcast. That's right around that period. Brian McLaren's books continuing to come out, stuff like that.
Or arguably like
Bell.
Rob Bell.
Yeah. Height of His Powers, Rob Bell, maybe around that era. So there was already, you're right, and I lived it. I was just thinking that like, that was 8 years ago. Like, I bet to people who like, for instance, found my show in the last month, the Trump is the beginning of that context for so many, especially younger people, but it really did predate that.
Yeah, and I mean the people I talked to for the book, who I found in all kinds of different ways. Like some of them I found on a lot of them I found on social media, people who were like talking about interesting things or themes that I wanted to get into. I would just reach out and be like, "Hey, can I interview you?"
Right.
And then there were people that I know personally in my own life, and but I found a range of things. Like there were some people for whom 2016 and everything that followed was the tipping point. It was the thing that broke the camel's back. But most of them had like questions about or issues with aspects of the evangelical subculture before that. And for other people, it was like they had left or they had moved away from that label. But then I think it was just the last several years have just sort of occasioned, I think, a coming together around talking about, because like around talking about what this means, because, you know, the secular national media has been talking about evangelicals so much. And we, I guess I'm part of that, talk about evangelicals a lot and have for years. But I think those conversations have been particularly heightened since Trump came along.
Yeah, because evangelicals are, I don't know, probably the sort of largest, fairly homogenous voting bloc now in America. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, I mean, so I looked at a bunch of data for this book, and I'm obsessed with the data. And, you know, this is based on sort of a synthesis of Pew and Public Religion Research Institute and talking to Robert Jones, the founder of PRRI. Yeah. So this is sort of like a synthesis of a bunch of data. But I think the best estimates would say that about 1 in 4 Americans or close to were white evangelicals, like roughly from around the early 90s to the mid 2000s. It bounced up and down for a bit. And then it fell off. Like it's down now like 14%-ish. So that's like a 10% decline basically in 20 years or so. And so when you say 14%, that's pretty close to the Black population of the country. And so it's which is held pretty steady. And, you know, Black voters overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, including Black Christians. White evangelicals overwhelmingly vote for Republicans. And that trend has only increased. Like that consolidation is just going up, up, up.
Yeah, like it's like a simmering, a reduction of the sauce. To 24 down to 14 was like, you got rid of you and me and like all my friends pretty much, and kept the true believers. And I mean that more in the socio-political sense than in the theological sense.
So, but to your larger point, yes. I mean, there was a time when it was the largest consolidated voting bloc, because if you look at like white Catholics, for example, who were, and I think still are roughly in the same ballpark in terms of the share of the population also declining, they are much more split. They're, right. You know, they tilt Republican these days, but not by a whole lot, only by a few percentage points. And, you know, they used to be fairly 50-50. So the bottom line is, at least historically, white evangelicals were the largest unified voting bloc. They are a shrinking group, but they are still very unified and even more pronouncedly Republican. And I think that's why they have such outsized influence, because of being in lockstep like that. But, the big question is, as white Christianity continues to decline in this country, how long does that last? Well, yeah, I mean, not to spar with someone who knows way more about this than I do, but my understanding, my more limited understanding of the data and trends would say that they're adding plenty of people to the movement. They're just adding people that wouldn't have been welcomed before because they weren't religious enough. But now, it's weird. It's almost like there are 2 or 3 different groups of white evangelicals all looking in the same direction and watching the same screens, but they can't see each other because, like, the people like extended family members of my friends and I who are still very devout, like, they would not feel comfortable sitting on the couch next to sort of some of the new contingent of white evangelical America, but there they are, and they're shared by a socio-political identity and a cultural identity, but the theology and the particulars of their faith may still be important to them as individuals, but they're no longer important to sort of the brand or the unifying strands of that group, that socio-political group. I mean, am I overstating things? I feel like I know less granularly about people who are coming in, but from the data I've seen, there are people coming in and people coming out. And And actually, the latest PRI data that just came out after my book was published shows a leveling off of evangelical decline. But I think, interestingly, the decline in evangelical identity has leveled off. But church attendance has fallen off down. So you have multiple things happening at the same. Who knows what that says? You also have, and I'm only speculating here, but you also have separately this Pew data from I think 2021 or 22 that said that white Americans who identify with Trump, there's at least some indication that they were maybe coming into the evangelical label, which is maybe what you're referring to.
That's what I'm referring to.
So yes, and so you have cross currents is the word I use, but the decline in evangelicalism is it's part of a larger decline in white Christianity, and it's actually more pronounced in other parts of the white Christian church. Like white Catholicism it appears to be losing more people more quickly than white evangelicalism. But there's been such a rapid shift in the last 10 to 20 years. And again, it's a group that has such unique outsized impact that anything that happens in white evangelicalism, is interesting to me. Also just because, we grew up in that world, but, it's just, it's a unique voting block. And then there's the whole separate question of like Latino evangelicals, right? Like where are their politics going to go? Which I didn't really go into in the book, but is something I'm super curious about.
Sure looks like rightward.
It seems to be, at least for a segment. Yeah.
For some segment. So speaking of growing up in this world, there may never have been an interview or podcast audience for whom you had to say fewer words about your upbringing for the audience to know what you're talking about. Nonetheless, let's get a real brief background, which then I'd like to eventually tie more into this decision to become a journalist, which is kind of the part of your story that I'm most interested in. It's the most unique compared to other people that I get to talk to on this show. But give us just some bullet points, and I trust me that we will fill in the rest with our knowledge of this subculture.
Okay. You can ask me to expand on anything you want.
Sure.
But the short version is that I grew up and was educated in kind of a broad spectrum of the conservative Christian / evangelical subculture. My church growing up was charismatic, non-denominational. My school, my K-12 school, was an independent Bible church school, kind of similar to Southern Baptist, but not Baptist. More towards the fundamentalist end of the spectrum than my church, but it didn't really matter because we all believed in Jesus. And then my college was an evangelical free college. My parents shifted to go into an evangelical free church around that time, kind of coincidentally, but one that was very non-denominational in flavor and vibes. I married the first time a Southern Baptist pastor's kid, so I had some exposure to that. His family, I think when they heard about me, wanted to know if I was Calvinist or not, which I was not. And so...
Which, of all people, shouldn't matter to Calvinists, right? You're not choosing anyway.
Right. Yeah.
There's a weird logical
point.
Irony in there.
It's a great point. So I've kind of covered the gamut, I think, of evangelical and evangelical adjacent expression and experience.
I think fantastic. I don't think we need any information than that. Like this world, we got you.
You got it,
Sarah.
Yeah.
We grok it. We're here. I know from, and by the way, I'll just say, I listened to a little bit of your conversation with Jamar Tisby, and similarly, I had a more moderate California evangelical, actually an interdenominational church, which was functionally a non-denom church by the time I was growing up in it. And then a more conservative Christian school experience. Most of the fundamentalists I knew, almost all of them were from school and not church. And most of my sort of religious trauma and issues that I have worked through came through school, not church, which is just interesting.
Although can I just say quickly, the population of my school, ironically, a lot of the parents were like less strict than my parents. They came from a variety of churches, but it was like the administration and the church.
Who are they going to hire? Who will work there for cheap? People with an ideological commitment. And I think that that's probably true across any number of businesses, organizations, industries where you don't have a big budget. Well, you find people who believe in the cause. I mean, it's, like one
That's
of
really
like
true.
for instance, the teacher I had who told us in his class, addressing all of the young women, or I mean, I guess they were girls, maybe 15, 16 years old at this time, addressing everyone and saying that if he looked at the right scan, he could point out every birth control pill they'd ever taken. He was an independently wealthy former chiropractor who was like living on his investments. So that's why he could teach there basically for free, which they needed. And that's how he could share that pseudoscientific, swill.
Wow, I really wish someone would have taken him up on that because I would have been fascinated.
Yeah, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. So from my skimming of the book, it seems like for you, kind of a lot of us can point to an issue or two that started the unraveling process, and it sounds like for you, it had a lot to do with hell, people of other faiths, people of maybe even the wrong kind of Christian faith, and all this idea that they're going to hell. And is that right? That's where the cognitive dissonance started to really sharpen?
A lot of it, yeah, because and I talk about like my grandpa is a central character in the book, who, as you find out, was not only not a Christian but also gay, and we were really, really focused on trying to convert him when I was growing up, and he had no interest in that, but he was like strangely like the person in my life who was the symbol of like secularism and damnation was also like the most successful person I knew, like most accomplished person I knew. I mean, a literal brain surgeon. And not that means you're necessarily a good person, but it was a weird incongruity in my life that like this person who was like one of the very few non-religious people I knew was also like this person we were really proud of, right? Like, I mean, and it was just this strange. And he was a good person. I mean, he wasn't a perfect person. Nobody is. But he was a great person. Like, he spent some of his retirement, volunteering at an AIDS clinic, as I understand it. And he, there are all these stories about how much he loved taking care of his pediatric patients and getting down on the floor and playing with little kids who were, in the neuro ward. And it's just like, how could looking at my grandpa's life, I was like, I don't see a whole lot that's wrong here. In fact, I see a lot that's really great. And then I think also just like the visceral fear I felt for his soul and the souls of several other extended family members, including my Catholic ones, or like lapsed Catholic ones, really. That shaped me so much because I think there was a part of me that was always like, this can't be right, And then a lot of other things started to not add up too as I got older.
And I take it that we are, just from your timeline and stuff, like roughly the same age. I don't know the new rules around women's age.
You can ask I'm 43. I don't care.
Okay,
I will
I'm
tell
40.
you how old I am when I'm 70. There's nothing wrong with getting older. In fact, it's a gift.
My new bit is I think it's actually sexist not to ask because it's patriarchal to assume that
women don't want to say their age.
Yeah, that women's age, like that would be embarrassing, is a remnant of patriarchy.
It is.
So I am boldly going forward as a fucking ally and asking every woman I know how old they are from now on.
I think we should all just say how old we are proudly because it's stupid.
Yeah, it is stupid. Okay, but so, we came of age in a very similar time. You're just a few years older. Would you say that you really became aware of the extent of this movement, this sort of deconstruction, ex-evangelical, whatever movement? Did you become aware of the scope and scale at a personal level first, or as a reporter first?
I would actually say as a reporter. I always, my whole adult life, have had this experience, which maybe you've had, of being at a party somewhere and you find the other kid who was raised, Assemblies of God or Pentecostal or Southern Baptist or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And you start trauma bonding in the corner with your beer that you shouldn't be drinking because you were raised evangelical. And, that's happened periodically. Or it's I've moved around a lot, and it's like anytime I would meet somebody who had a similar background, we'd all end up kind of just unpacking, you're sharing your cultural references, your purity culture trauma, your focus on the family Brio, Adventures in Odyssey, and I've seen some evangelicals make fun of referring to Adventures in Odyssey like online as if we're talking about that as like a source of deep trauma, and it's not. It's like the point isn't that all of it's a source of deep trauma. The point is that it's a shared subculture that like other people don't get if they're not from it, and some of it for some of us is traumatic, sure, but some of it's just the culture we grew up in, and
it's a real mix.
So I knew that. But I think it wasn't until I started seeing the ex-evangelical hashtag, I think, was only created at around 2016. And your podcast dates back to then. I mean, I knew about like the Emergent church stuff, but I was kind of in my own space of like having young kids and doing my career and just kind of, I didn't spend a lot of time with that world. Like I paid some attention to it. I read some Rachel Held Evans, but it wasn't a huge part of my life. So I guess the answer is it was a growing awareness, and it was, some of it was personal. And then, but I feel like there has been an explosion since about 2016. Does that feel right to you?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because it's, well, you actually used a phrase, I wrote it down, unavoidable and huge. And you weren't talking about this, but I was like, that's a pretty good phrase for the Trump evangelical moment. Unavoidable and huge. And from there, just like, a giant boulder being dropped into the pool, and you can't help but feel the ripples anywhere in the pool. One thing that I was thinking, though, as you were talking, I think I had an interesting sort of frog allowed to boil more slowly in the water in a good way. I don't mean that negatively. Because where I was having those conversations as an emerging adult around like my 20 to 28-ish, I was on tour in a rock band. And we were not a Christian band, but we were all Christians. And there was a whole thing back then of like, we're Christians in a band, we're not a Christian band. That's the thing that all the bands full of Christians were trying to do, because we all wanted to be general market bands. That's the bands that we looked up to more, because that was sort of the cream of the crop, and the Christian market was seen, usually rightfully so, as kind of the B movie version of secular music. But so many people in those bands, even if the bands were not connected to Christian institutions, learned to play and sing in youth group or in church choir. So there was this overpopulation in a sense, like punching above our numbers of youth group kids, even on something like the Vans Warped Tour. Like, just so there were a lot of these organic opportunities, like the party with the beer. I mean, that was what I was doing those years. My party with the beer was like after the show or backstage before the show or at a festival, meeting another band whose music I liked, And so it's interesting to have, you and I and others, we had a lot of context before Trump happened, and we had been processing this for a long time before Trump happened. And that strikes me as really different than someone for whom the Trump moment would have been like a what the hell, like a big splash of cold water. I remember being kind of shocked by the number, but I was kind of anticipating something like it by that point, because I sort of could read the tea leaves.
Yeah, I mean, I found myself getting almost kind of frustrated by being asked the question over and over and over and over again about like, why do evangelicals support Trump? Because it's like, well, if you understand the mindset and the thinking and the values and the priorities, it's not really that surprising. I mean, it is on some level. And I mean, I myself, with some distance from it at that point, I think I did expect that there would be some kind of a collapse. But when there wasn't, it was kind of like, okay, well, I mean, this is a very sort of pragmatic relationship here. It's a partnership. And I always say, I think there's some misconception. And I think there's some people who want to believe that Trump hijacked evangelicalism and changed it. And I think he amplified certain aspects of it and tapped into them, but I don't know that it was like a material change,
Yeah, I think Kristen Dumais has made the argument that in Jesus and John Wayne, for instance, that he's a natural, logical endpoint of something that had been building for decades. And I know that you must know John Ward, the journalist and former Yahoo News guy.
I know his work, yeah.
Yeah, or his work anyway, just because there can't be that big of a world of former.
I think we've had some contact on
evangelicals.
social media, but I don't know him personally.
Yeah, okay, it's fine. But professional colleague. But I love his. I've from the beginning, in the depolarized days, I found this language of his so helpful, and it's for me one of probably maybe 2 or 3 main pieces of understanding what happened in all of that, and that is the idea of parallel institutions. And you talk about this in the book, that we had evangelical versions of like anything you would spend your time doing, from, morning devotions to, we didn't have evangelical breakfast cereal, but maybe somebody did that.
Somebody needs to market that because it would sell.
There was Ezekiel bread, Ezekiel 4:9 bread, but that's actually more of a health food kind of a thing than a Christian thing. And but then you turn on the radio, or you open a book, or you want to put on some music, or you're going to go to the movies that night, or you're like anything. There's a Christian version of it, and now in our so that as a sort of training ground before social media, before fake news and misinformation and the blurring of the lines between fact and fiction in printed digital media, like we were really set up as a subculture to distrust mainstream institutions like the press, like medicine, like evolutionary science, and anything else in the kind of larger science world. And that's also one of those priming things, like the sort of masculinity stuff that Kristen Dumais talks about. That's another thing that helps me kind of understand what had been building. And that's very close to my life, because I found I listened to a lot of those bands, and like that was a part of my culture as well, not all of my culture.
Yeah, that's why I cite Kristen's work a lot, because it's very informative and foundational for mine. But I think that parallel infrastructure wasn't so important. And it's part of why when you leave evangelicalism or move away from it in some way, it can be so disorienting, because when I got out into the, sort of real world post-evangelical college, I just kind of would realize how much I didn't know that other people knew. Like I hadn't had the same experiences. I hadn't had the same pop cultural references. I knew some of them, but it was always kind of like at a remove. And and I think it was also like, you kind of have to go, whoa, there's like a whole other world out there and a whole other way of thinking. And you're so warned against it, like warned against being of the world. Yeah. Warned against trusting your, leaning on your own understanding. I quote some of those verses in the book. Just, that you're kind of systematically, I guess, guided or just taught to reject all those outside things. And so when you start opening yourself up to them a little bit, particularly, if you find it unavoidable to, because things just aren't making sense and you're trying to figure things out, it can be really disorienting at first.
I'm going through that even still as I get more experience as a therapist, because I do cognitive therapy primarily with my clients. And a big part of cognitive therapy is looking for evidence, like evidence outside our thoughts and feelings, stuff that, like when I talk about evidence with clients, I talk about third parties, like something that a third party, like a judge or a jury, would count as evidence. And that already kind of brushes and pushes against some of the way that I was taught to think as an evangelical, where I think, and that would apply to any conservative religious, maybe even just conservative ethnic groups. I don't know. But like, if it's a tight-knit, conservative-leaning group with clear boundaries, there's a certain way you gotta teach kids to think so that they can succeed in the way you want them to succeed, given that view of the world. And it does have to lead with suspicion toward outgroup things. Like that's almost like a psychological law or something. Like if
I
you
think
raise,
it's just a tendency of groups, period. I don't think it's just conservative groups. I think it's groups and institutions have a tendency to adopt a certain culture. And I think that like one of the pitfalls is groupthink, and it can happen anywhere.
I mean, I think it can happen anywhere. And you do see like, I think there's really interesting stuff. People are doing interesting work around sort of the overlap of spirituality and conspiracy theories and like kind of left-leaning natural health groups. But I would say like even within Christianity, your average Episcopal or Unitarian Universalist congregation, like those churches are full of people who have at personality level are open to new experience and new ideas. And it would be important for them, like it is for my wife and I, it's important for us to encourage that in our boys. So we will not be teaching them to distrust anything from the outgroup, and we will be teaching them to like, hey, try something new. Go talk to that kid who looks different, Like, so I do think there is a conservatism lens that I would put on it sort of at a individual and group psychological level of like, that is not a group full of people for whom openness to new experience is a huge value. It's a group for whom stability and, not changing too much is a core value.
Sure. Yeah. I'm just saying, I think that groupthink is a risk for any group to some degree.
Oh, absolutely. And every time I lose people to my left, it is because of pointing that out. Because there are psychological traps to fall into. We're not immunized as people on the left from groupthink.
But I mean I hear you. I mean I think being responsive, being open to new experiences, being responsive to reason, being willing to trust science, understanding that science changes and corrects itself. That's part of the process. But fundamentally understanding the scientific method and the value of it, and being willing to trust people with more expertise than your own in their subject matter. I think those are all really important traits for, being able to self-reflect and not be as susceptible to groupthink.
Yeah, which is interesting because like I feel I must raise my children in that way, and it's not hard to see where that doesn't totally go against the way that I was raised in particular. Like my dad was a therapist, so we had a sense of external scientific validation of things. He would listen to psychologists who were not only Christians, about how to do his job. But I noticed this. It almost has, some clients almost have to work on that step as its own thing to be able to go, oh, like, you mean I can just look for evidence of things and then make a judgment based on the evidence? Because that's really not what we were taught to do. I mean, a certain kind of evidence, I guess. Like it was spoken of the same way, but it wasn't actually a commitment to kind of whatever reality might show us when we look carefully.
Yeah, it's interesting because we had like a lot of apologetics books in our home. I don't know if you did, but like Josh
plenty
McDowell,
of apologetics oh yeah, plenty of that.
Hank Hanegraaff, later, Lee Strobel. So there was kind of this idea that we had to be able to like intellectually defend our faith, but it was always like you were supposed to go on that journey and arrive at a specific destination. Like if the searching made you feel like something didn't add up, or like that wasn't really an open possibility. And so it was less about like asking questions and more about like knowing how to answer questions that people might present to you.
And
that's how it seems to me.
Exactly. And please contrast that with the job of a journalist.
Right. So, and I always, when I say this, I always say I never would have been able to articulate this in this way when I was, 23.
Sure.
But in retrospect, I think that a lot of the reason I became a journalist is because I was just like hungry for space to ask questions. And I sensed that there were all these other perspectives out there that I was either not exposed to or was exposed to them in a like almost like an inoculation kind of way. Like, here's a little bit of talk about evolution, but why it's bad. And
Exactly. Yeah.
I just always had this kind of really deep instinct that something wasn't right, and that I don't want to say being manipulated because that sounds so sinister. And I don't think it was, I think it was all like my parents, I think they meant very well. They believed that they were protecting me from like evil, but it felt like, it did feel manipulative sometimes. Like, look at this, but don't look too closely. Don't ask too many questions that might lead you in the wrong direction. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Whereas in journalism, it was like, people get in a room and they argue with each other, and they're supposed to, you're supposed to shoot people down, not shoot people down, but you're supposed to like look for a perspective that you hadn't thought about. And news is often like news is like something new. Like news is often around conflict, which sometimes is a problem. And maybe we exaggerate conflict, but like that sort of space between perspectives is like central to journalism. And I think I was fascinated by it. And so, and I remember like when I was also interested in journalism just simply because I always loved reading and writing and words and people. And it was just kind of something I gravitated toward. But I remember when I was in college and trying to figure out my career path, my mom wanted me to go work for like World Magazine. That
big event, parachurch organization. Yeah.
Yeah. And I always like to say like World has done some really good work in recent years on sort of, critiquing inside the house and investigative work on sex abuse. And I applaud them for that. So I'm not mocking World or dissing it in any way.
But that's what your mom would have thought. Like, oh, honey, go use those skills here. Like that would have been very natural for her.
Right. But I didn't want that. I didn't want to be sort of preaching to the choir. That was
not what I... How early did you realize that was the decision? Like what age were you when you recognized I actually need to just go to the regular outlet in order to do this the right way? I'd
say it was around sophomore or junior year of college.
Yeah.
And, another interesting moment for me was in 2002. So like that would have been right between sophomore and junior year, I think. Junior and senior year. Yeah. I went to DC and participated in a journalism program that was sort of a consortium of other evangelical colleges, kids from other evangelical colleges who were interested in journalism. And the philosophy there was that they were preparing us for mainstream journalism. And that really appealed to me. Like, I just felt like I want to be talking to everyone. I shouldn't be afraid of anything. I didn't want to be afraid of ideas. And
kudos to whoever put that on. I mean, that's, like I thought you were going to go a Bill Gothard direction of like all these evangelical aspiring journalists, and they're actually prepping us to become mouthpieces for dominionist theology and, Falwell tactics or some shit.
No. And I the founder of that program was pretty conservative, but he believed in the principles of journalism. And that really appealed to me. It felt like very intellectually honest. And so that was the path I set out on. And here I am.
That is really great. It keeps reminding me of some of the therapy work, but I feel like I've talked about that a lot here.
You can talk about therapy work. I've always said if I did anything else, I would want to be a therapist, because my favorite thing about my job is like sitting with people and listening to their stories. So I'm really interested. Not to reduce therapy to that, but
how dare you? No, don't worry. We're good.
But I like that part of it, the human connection. So
and there is, here's something interesting. There is a kind of openness required of me as a clinician. It's different than journalism. It's distinct from it, but there almost is. I do think that a part of my job is investigation, and I think of it a bit more like detective work maybe than journalism, because it's just a bit more. It tends to be a bit more granular and specific. It's like, can we determine like what is causing this problem? we're following like little tiny trails, and we're trying to find something very small and specific, rather than kind of a canvassing thing. Again, not to reduce journalism to canvassing for large amounts of data, but like there is an investigation there, and in order for me to do that part of my job well, as well as maybe other parts of just like really understanding where a person is coming from, for both of those aspects of the job, I do have to have a kind of radical openness to reality, which includes the reality of the person in front of me, and trying to get into their mind and what they've experienced and the effects that may have had, and how that would be sort of affecting the way they think and speak now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that feels like an overlap, and it feels again like where a little bit of the rubber meets the road of coming out of an evangelical mindset, of like dropping some of the walls, dropping some of the defenses there, and opening the arms up a bit, which feels as like a recovering evangelical, like a little dangerous at times.
Yeah.
To be kind of radically open to that.
Because I don't know about you, but I would feel, and it wasn't like anyone ever told me this, but I felt this sense often when I was growing up that like you would only be so open to other people's stories, because if something about their story challenged your paradigms, it might be dangerous. And so, like somebody saying that they were gay and they had known it since they were a child. Like that idea was like, well, that can't be right. Or you had to fit it into your box of like, well, we're all sinful from birth, so that's why. But then like, how do you resolve that with the idea that God makes everybody special and in his image, and you know what I mean? And so like, there was a time when I would have felt like I had to struggle to make sense of something like that. I mean, obviously now I'm completely LGBTQ affirming, and I don't see it that way at all, but I'm speaking about the way that we were taught to see things.
Sure.
Or, even just encountering somebody with a different belief system, like you have to slot it into like, well, they've been misled, by the devil or something. And then, you realize that talking to people who believe differently, like, well, they've come to that conclusion really sincerely, and like they're not hostile to God, or I'm saying, I guess what I'm trying to say is
totally
there were just really rigid categories for people and for how to understand other people, and letting go of those a little bit is, I think, part of the process. So yes, I very much relate to what you're saying.
Earlier you said about one of my points that applies to all groups. So I'm going to do the same thing, because I see that in my own circles on the left as well. Like, imagine someone with a fundamentally conservative viewpoint that is like getting some traction, and it's like, I can't take it too seriously. Like, I can't. For some people, like I can't actually be open to the idea that Joe Rogan is a net plus for society, because if I were to believe that, I would lose friends. Like Josh Gilbert, who edits this show, and we do some patron exclusive episodes every month. He told a story 2 episodes ago. He's like, with his friends, like sometimes, or some of his friends, if someone mentions anything about cops, like everybody has to go around and say ACAB. All cops are bastards. Like, okay, we're all still friends here. We all still agree. And I'm just like, holy shit, that sounds like Bible study to me. Like, that feels the exact same, and I am fucking out. I am a draft dodger for that aspect of the culture war. Put me on the chopper. Get me out of here. So I feel like I have a sensitivity to seeing that on the left because of the way I was raised. Absolutely.
I mean, this is kind of what I was getting at earlier when I was talking about the susceptibility to groupthink. I mean, I think that there is, and I don't want to say that both sides are equally bad. I'm not saying that, because there are different situations going on the right and the left, and different threats and different problems structurally and so forth.
Yeah, agreed.
But I'm 100% with you. My ex-husband, who I'm still friends with, and I used to sometimes, when we would see things like that dynamic playing out, we would have this little saying, which is like, everywhere is church. Everywhere is church. Like people can get churchy anywhere. And, I actually think that sensitivity helps me be a better journalist, because I think we should always approach everybody with compassion and a certain degree of openness. Now, of course, there are some ideas that are just really bad and really vile and really bigoted. And I don't think we have to entertain every idea equally. But you can say that and also say okay, well, maybe I need to understand why people are feeling this way, And you may still feel like underneath it is something that's vile, but at least having the curiosity to try to understand what's going on, I think helps us make better sense of the world and ask better questions and do that kind of investigation more thoroughly. So,
do you think that this is probably hard to get one's arms around, but journalism, there is a wide spectrum in terms of sort of the ideological pre-commitments of the journalistic outlets, right? So many of us have seen these kind of news sources mapped out on a left to right continuum. Sometimes there's an x-axis of how evidence-based they are or something like that or whatever. And all of those outlets have to employ journalists. So people work for those outlets as journalists. I wonder if you think that there are, I don't know if you would call, what would you call the difference between someone who would feel much more comfortable writing for Democracy Now! Versus someone who would feel much more comfortable writing for the Associated Press or PBS? Or even Newsmax, for that matter.
I imagine that it's somebody with a very strong ideological commitment that goes to either Newsmax or Democracy Now! I think that, I've never actually asked my colleagues, why are you at this outlet or that one? But I think I assume, basically, probably mostly from my own experience, that people self-select to some degree. And I think because of the way I was raised, of course I have opinions and I have values and I do vote. Some journalists, I've heard, especially old school journalists don't vote. I vote. I've always been a registered independent and pretty happily so. Partly because I'm a journalist, but I that feels fine to me most of the time. But I think because of the way I was raised, I'm a little skeptical of my own opinions and my own sensibilities. And having been told that it was my duty to share my ideas with the world, first of all, evangelizing religiously, but also that had such a political mission as well. I guess I don't want to, I worry this is going to sound like false humility, but I think it's actually maybe just insecurity. But I just don't take my own opinions that seriously. And I definitely am not it's almost kind of triggering to me to feel like I'm supposed to push my opinion on someone else. I was asked to push my ostensible opinion on the whole world my entire childhood.
Yeah.
And I just really didn't want to then and really don't want to now. Which isn't to say that I don't believe things, and which isn't to say that I don't think there's right and wrong, and which isn't to say that I don't think we should call a spade a spade. But I'm just so much more comfortable in a space where my job is to ask questions and try to understand things better than I am in a space where my job is to try to get everybody to agree with me. That's just kind of, if I have any sense of calling, it's that.
It's interesting. It sounds like journalism for you, and it happened later for me, but getting into psychology for me were paths to sort of simultaneously see what was missing in the tools we were given growing up, but then also, as we could identify that, to chart a path forward in which we were partially inoculated against, other forms of groupthink and, overly ideologically committed to where you're actually sacrificing your ability to see things clearly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, I feel, I mean, I'm probably repeating myself here, but I do, whenever I get in a space where I feel like people are a little too high on their own ideas, I get a little allergic to that. Like, and I don't care what the ideas are. I'm just kind of like, ugh, there's like an ick factor for me. And I feel it sometimes in liberal spaces as well, and it's like, I probably shouldn't say any more than that, but it's not, it's more of, it's an aesthetic thing just because of how we were raised.
Yeah. Well, and that way, like that's been one of the interesting things for me about bringing things so often back to evidence with my clients. Mm-hmm. I imagine there must be something similar about, for instance, bringing pieces to your editor, bringing them to the fact checker, even before you bring them a piece, like thinking through the way that you want to write it and approach it. And what are the things that you need to learn first before you're comfortable doing anything here?
Yeah.
There's more steps to that. Sometimes these moments are quite brief in a therapy session but that openness to evidence, that sort of openness to reality, I'm almost even starting to use I'm thinking of it. I think I may have said it earlier, but I'm even starting to use this with clients, like a radical openness to reality, which can really be medicine. It's just, yeah, I keep coming back to this because I'm so fascinated by sort of the interplay with our upbringing, but also the sort of freedom and the way that approach to the world is an advertisement for itself in my life. And I guess, do you feel that same way, that these sort of journalistic commitments that force you to think this way, they sort of argue for themselves?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think people like, I feel like one real gift of my upbringing is that I am able to sort of hear things like I'm able to sort of put on a hat and think about like how a conservative or a liberal, or hopefully in the middle, would hear things and see things. And I feel like that's like kind of a gift. Like I feel like I have an ability to choose words that will speak to people from a variety of perspectives. Not about anything and everything. I mean, there's real division in this country, and there's real susceptibility to misinformation in a lot of spaces. And so it's not like magic or anything, but I think that when you try to and I think going to what you're saying, like the journalistic principle, trying to stick to specifics and facts, describing rather than characterizing things, just describing what we see. I mean, I've covered abortion a lot, and I try to use really specific medical terms, and try to avoid loaded terms as much as possible. And sometimes you get flack from either side for that.
Right.
But the more I'm able to do that, I think the more I want to communicate with as many people as possible. And people will not agree necessarily on things just because you do that, but you can at least have more of a conversation. And I think that's really important. I always talk about like not making unforced errors with our language, not using language that will just immediately shut people down. Mm-hmm. Again, not to minimize the real differences, because there are giant differences in how people see, especially that issue.
Oh, yeah.
But like, I mean, the whole idea of democracy is that a pluralistic democracy is that we take people from a whole bunch of different perspectives and views and somehow have a country. And like, I think one important step toward doing that is we have to be able to communicate with one another and not talk past one another, or if we're going to get anywhere at all. So I see that as sort of part of my mission, which again, to your point, involves trying to be as fact-based and evidence-based, and just sort of like using neutral language as much as possible when it's appropriate.
Appropriate, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, I have loved this conversation. Thank you so much for coming and joining me. I know you've been doing just a shitload of press for this book. And so if I were you, I'd be exhausted. You've got children. You've got a full-time job. Thanks for giving me an hour.
Oh, my pleasure. Good conversation. Thank you.
We'll have a link to the book and, like your Twitter or X profile or whatever else in the show notes so people can follow up with you there. And we'll have a link to your Substack as well.